Alright, we're finally here. Hi, this is Misha, and we've been leading up to this. The German Tiger Panzer, sometimes known as the Panzer 6. A truly heavy tank, almost super heavy by World War II standards. And there are a lot of truths and a lot of myths about this vehicle. So I've got three 1/72 scale diecast models here. A pretty normal one from, this is a World of Tanks brand, but it's the Atlas D'Agostini Altea. Perfectly good tank. Then we have an interesting demolition tank variant with the kind of interesting coating on it to make it non-metallic, non-magnetic. This is from Dragon. And then we have one that actually I waited to get and do this video when it came in. This is from Precision Model Art, and this was a bit of a gamble. I wasn't sure what this would turn out to be like, and it has some interesting surprises. So, with no further ado, we'll start off with the simplest model on the spinny thing. Like I said, these models are not bad for the money. They're kind of a step up from Eagle Moss, but they're still very much a value. A lot cheaper than Hobby Master Dragon. And they still have rotating turret, even elevating gun, rubber tracks, usually have antenna. This one has the optional machine gun on the top. These aren't bad at all for what they are. Okay, so the story, the myth, is that Germany went into World War II with the Panzer II, very lightly armed, 2 centimeter, the Panzer III with its 3.7 centimeter, and the Panzer IV in small numbers with a short-barreled, low-velocity 7.5 centimeter. It's basically true, but the myth is that they thought that would be enough, that they were using blitzkrieg tactics, speed, and mobility over armor and firepower, and that they didn't know what they were doing, and it was a total shock to them when they encountered the Russian Kv-1, and namely the Russian T-34, after Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. And so they were left to quickly scramble to develop a counter, and that's how we get the amazing Tiger. That's only partially true. Less so than more so. In fact, yeah, this goes way, way back. If you recall, when I was talking about Guderian and his plans for the new Panzer Corps, back when we were talking about the Panzer 1, 2, and the 3 and the 4 of that video, from the very beginning he considered having a heavy so-called breakthrough tank. And the first kind of documentation we have of this concept came in October of 1935, when there's a Waffen-Amt, well, what will become the Waffen-Amt rather, study wanting to have roughly a 30-ton tank with about 30 centimeter would be very impressive, 30 millimeter of armor, and armed with a long-barreled 7.5 centimeter gun. Actually very impressive for that day and time, kind of combining the best features of the Panzer III and IV. The problem is they really didn't have the engineering ability to make an engine, a transmission, a final drive system to make this work at the time. And we were looking at in the previous video the Gross tractor and the NB, because I don't speak German, I'm saying NB. And those programs are still ongoing in 1935. They weren't canceled until 1936. Thus, in January of 1937, this project, well, not this one, but one of its grandfathers starts. There's a lot of these. Henschel is requested to design a 30 to 33 ton tank with a heavier gun, maybe 7.5 centimeter, maybe 10.5. They even looked at doing a 12.8 centimeter gun. They're not really sure, but it needs to be more armed and armored. Well, this project goes a little bit, but then in 1938 it's canceled and replaced with the VK-30 project. And here we have Henschel and Porsche, the company, although Ferdinand Porsche is in charge, competing, and they both have designs. Now the VK-30-1s, H and P respectively, are medium tanks. There's also the VK-36-1H, which was meant to be a heavy tank, and at this point more armor is required, and they're kind of going back and forth if it should be a 7.5 or an 8.8 centimeter gun. And so this is what we're thinking about in 1939 when the war begins, and moving into 1940 and the invasion of France. It was actually this and the combat with the British and the French tanks, more than anything else, that really pushed the program ahead. Still yet to get the Tiger name, but it'll get it soon. So they realized that they need a heavier tank with a large, powerful gun and yet thicker armor. And this was going up against mainly the British Matilda, because even though the Matilda's gun, either the 1 or the 2, was not great, the armor was very thick. And even the French tanks, like the R-35 and the S-35 and the Char B-1, really showed a lot of things that Germany needed to learn. So these were actually the basis. And so in May of 1941, Henschel and Porsche are tasked with creating a new tank. Nominally, it's going to be 40 tons. This will quickly grow to be 45 tons. And the new program is known as VK-45. And they will base it on their past work and research. And at this point, they're still not sure about the main gun, but they are sure that they want about 100 millimeter of frontal armor protection, yada yada. And then, of course, Operation Barbarossa happens. And in the very beginning, German forces encounter mostly older T-26s, some T-28s, some BT-5s, and BT-7s. But then the KV-1s come up, and to a lesser extent the KV-2s, and then the T-34s start to come towards the end of that year in numbers. The first kind of mass encounter with them was around October of 1941. And this really drives home the point that no, we need to go to an 8.8 centimeter gun. Let's stop worrying about the 7.5. And this is really when the weight climbs firmly to 45 tons and actually beyond, because Hitler keeps adding on a longer gun and yet more armor. One decision was good, one maybe less useful. And originally, the two design teams were supposed to have prototypes available by June of 1942. Well, the demands are increased, and now they're expected to have them available for Hitler's birthday. How sweet is that? April 20, 1942. So almost 2 months closer. They have very little time to really develop this, and it shows. The tank here was always a bit of a rush job, and in some ways was always meant to be a bit of a stopgap intermediate solution. The successor tank was always planned, but they needed to get something into service quickly because the war is starting to drag out in 1942. Now, the Porsche design was quite interesting and revolutionary, especially its gasoline-electric engine and so on. The Henschel was more conventional, kind of based on the Panzer 3 and 4 research with a little bit of the old gross tractor stuff thrown in for good measure, just kind of based on everything. And they actually ended up using mostly Krupp designed turrets, although there's what they call the Porsche turret. That's a longer story for another day. It was to kind of fit the Porsche hull. By January of 1942, Hensel's getting the first hull, the first chassis ready, and the first turret is barely ready by April of 42, and they literally pull an all-nighter to mate the hull and turret together on April 17 because it's got to take a trip. It's got a ticket, on a railroad for Der Fuhrer's birthday. And of course, the design team at Porsche is having similar stress. Now, it should be pointed out that Ferdinand Porsche and Hitler were buddies. So, truth is, he was rooting for the Porsche design, the VK45-01P, to win. And at this point, the weights creeped over 50 tons, up to 54 tons, light loaded. Yeah. So both prototypes are slapped together, and the Hensel wins. Why? Reality simply set in. The Porsche design was too advanced, too new. It would have taken longer to get into production. It required more precious metals, for example, copper, which Germany did not have much of by 1942, at least comparatively speaking. And the Hensel design could just go straight into production, more or less. It used mostly known technologies, for better or worse. It might have also had something to do with the fact that the Porsche caught fire during the demonstration. Now, both of them had major problems. They both didn't run perfectly. But, breaking down is one thing. Bursting into flames. Hitler has a lot of bad things to say about him, but I don't believe he was a pyromaniac. So I don't think he really liked that. So, grudgingly, the VK45-1H was selected for further development, and by May, the next prototype was ready. And during testing in June and July, it continued to show major problems. The engine was underpowered, the transmission and final drive had issues. It really wasn't ready for prime time. Yet, Hitler ordered 200 immediately, and so it was put into production. And the first examples would come out in August of 1942, although it was not planned to send them into the field until really the beginning of 1943. So there should be time for development, except there wasn't because Hitler again intervened. But with that said, let's talk about the tank design itself. What makes the Tiger? Originally this was known, by the way, as the Kfz.182, and by this time it is known as the Tiger. Interestingly, the name was kind of given to it by Ferdinand Porsche. He didn't seem to be much of a, sore loser about the whole thing, frankly. Maybe it was a weight off his shoulders not to have to do this impossible task. But it would soon be renamed to Kfz.181 once the Tiger II came along in the following year. So, about the tank. Let's change out the Model 2. Here is the Precision Model Art version. As you know, the Tiger was a large tank. It was about 21 feet, not counting the main gun, with it rotated forward about 28 feet long. It was just shy of 12 feet wide and just shy of 10 feet tall. It was 54 tons light loaded, but when armed up for combat with all its ammunition, crew, supplies, just shy of 57 tons. Yeah. It had about 100 millimeters of front armor, although a few spots would get up to about 120. What really was an improvement over the Panther side armor, 60 to 80 millimeters versus the Panther's very thin. It used a torsion bar suspension with 2 sets of road wheels. Interesting design, but obviously would have issues. And it was actually fitted with about the same engine. It had a reasonably good top speed on road of up to 45 kilometers per hour and down to about 20 to 25 cross country, but that's kind of ideal conditions. The engine was never majorly upgraded. After the 250th tank, they would give it a slightly better engine, but nothing extraordinary. This really could have benefited from a diesel, but the Germans never really had a diesel tank engine, so they had to go with petrol, gasoline, and so it was a gas guzzler, kind of an ongoing thing. The, of course, main element was the gun. This was the first German production tank to mount an 8.8 centimeter main gun, and it is very long with a big muzzle brake. This gun is probably the star of the show, along with its aiming, its optics, one of the best features. They carried about 92 rounds for it, typically about half armor piercing and half high explosive. And for support, they had at least 2 MG34s, 1 coax and 1 in the hull, but usually there would be a third mounted on the roof, nominally for air defense or just, to have it. Typically, they would carry between 4,500 and 5,000 8mm rounds for the machine guns. And there's a crew of 5, radio operator / gunner in the right, driver, commander, gunner, loader in the turret. And there would be special command versions known as the Kfz.181 and Kfz.181, depending on exactly which radio sets and comm gear they had. Yeah, it was impressive for what it was, but typical German over-engineering. This turret, the traverse system, was very precise, very easy to lay the gun. Everything about this gun really was accurate, and it was relatively easy for the driver to drive. He had an actual steering wheel instead of levers. There was always a danger of overheating the engine, that stuff, but a skilled driver knew how to tell the vehicle and knew how to not push it harder than it needed to go. So it was a matter of training more than anything else. And the Germans considered it rather spacious, at least compared to the previous Panzers they were dealing with. There are a few neat things about this model I do want to show you too. You can remove the turret's lid, roof, and see inside. There is a full gun breech, seating inside for crew. It all moves. I think that's really quite nifty. Uncertain if you can make it out, but they even give you a couple of 88mm shells, rounds for it, and they will even load in the breech. Very tiny, but they're there. And finally, I guess because it was such an important part of the tank, they even give you a little model of the engine, and it's actually metal. Small details, but it's things like that that I think we enjoy. Now, the first tanks would roll off the assembly line on August 4, 1942. And in the beginning, they would build about 2 dozen a month, but this would increase. Now in March of 43, it would be redesignated Kfz.181 because the Tiger II is on the drawing boards and they know it's going to be going into production. There would be some other changes. The cupola for the commander would be altered a bit. The turret would be standardized. One interesting feature it had, because of its heavy weight, originally it was fitted with a deep wading kit, a snorkel and other stuff. It could go nearly 5 meters underwater, so pretty deep river. But in the summer of 43, right before the 500th tank was built, they deleted the feature. It was not really terribly useful. It was expensive, hard to set up. Of course, the reason they originally included it was this was really too heavy to go across most bridges, which were rated about 35, maybe 40 tons maximum. Oh well. So once the kit was deleted, it could only ford rivers that were about 2 meters deep. But this didn't seem to be a major thing. They would also add removable mud guards quite early in production, and a few other little changes. And production would run until August of 1944, by which time it was replaced by the Tiger II, the King Tiger. But in this video I really want to focus on the original Tiger because it is often kind of overlooked, and more were produced, nearly 3 times as many compared to the King Tiger, so it's not really fair to ignore this one. So with that, it's 2 years, nearly 3, 2.5 at least, military service. Only a handful of tanks were out of the factory and through with initial testing in August of 42. Nevertheless, Hitler was way impatient, so he insisted that 4 be sent to the front in Russia. These would be deployed near Leningrad. They would be in theater by the 16th, and they would be engaging Russian forces by the 22nd, 23rd. And yes, their main gun proved to be very accurate and devastating. But this was designed as an offensive breakthrough tank to punch through the lines and take advantage on its own terms. As a defensive and support tank, it had some issues. And they quickly realized that starting and stopping, changing directions, changing gears, it taxed the transmission, it overheated the engine, and they realized that terrain like swamps, marshes, heavy forest, heavy brush were not this tank's friend. And later, of course, that'll be extended to urban fighting too. So basically what Hitler did, the 4 tanks he sent did nothing there. And he gave the Russians a shot at capturing one, which they did. Now, German troops had orders to blow up their tanks if they had to abandon them, but one of them wasn't, so the Russians got to study it. And more were deployed towards Russia to try to reinforce their forces fighting to gain complete control of Stalingrad, but the Tigers would be too late. They wouldn't make it there. But they would end up fighting kind of a retreating action throughout. Now, the story in North Africa would go a little differently. They would land there at the beginning of December 1942 and initially go up against tanks like the American M3 Lee. And these engagements showed that the Tiger's armor was very good. Even at close range, the Lee could not effectively penetrate the Tiger. And so, yeah, the North African results were better, but very few were there. The first Tiger would be lost to an enemy gun January 20th, 1943, when essentially a lucky shot from a British 6-pounder, a 57mm gun, would take one out. Well, it would take the turret out, stop it from moving, and the crew would abandon it. And things would progress from there. 2 heavy divisions were at Kursk in July of 1943. Because there were not enough and never would be enough Tigers to meet demands, They were put into special heavy Panzer divisions, kind of a response division. Typically, they were supposed to be 17 tanks. They weren't always, even frequently, were not at full strength. But they were basically meant to be rapid response. And again, that's not exactly playing to the tank's strengths. The good news is, by Kursk, a lot of the early teething issues had been worked out. The bad news is, well, Kursk is a bloodbath and the Germans lost, and they lost many Tigers there and upon the retreat in August. And of course, the Eastern Front would continue to be a meat grinder for all German armor. Let's put our third and final model on the spinny thing. This is from Dragon, and this one has the Zimmerit coating. This is something the Germans applied to their tanks and other vehicles in mid to late 43, and would do that for about a year because they were worried about sticky mines, essentially magnetic mines. Turns out there's nothing to worry about. The Allies weren't using them, but that's the Germans for you. So this model has an interesting texture and presumably look to it as well. And this is a demolition Tiger. Goes to show you these were being used in places like Italy once the invasion began there. And there were some Tigers set up to be retrieval vehicles, recovery vehicles. This is similar but different. It actually has a boom with an explosive satchel charge on the end. And these were meant to lay these down and detonate minefields. And so their main guns are removed. These were not factory configurations, but a handful were done by the troops engineer corps in the field. I didn't actually mean to buy this model, but I did because I didn't really know what it looked like. And it is kind of interesting, and it shows one of the variants. Typically I stick to the standard tanks, but there you go. I should also point out that in late 43, Allied bombing raids were intensifying, and they really put a hurting on the Hinchdale factory that was doing final assembly for all of these, as well as some of the subcontractors. So production of the Tiger would slow at the end of the year, but the Germans would reorganize, and actually production would be up to 100 tanks a month again by January of 1944. So a pretty impressive logistical feat considering just how time-consuming and resource-intensive these were to produce. They were about twice as expensive and took about twice as long to make as, say, a Panzer IV. And they sucked up a lot of resources. That's pretty famously known. Of course, they were able to deliver, too. The high water mark for the number of these fielded came in July of 44. They had about 670 operational in the field, at least, on paper. So right after D-Day, they were at their most. But this is also when they're being replaced by the Tiger II. In fact, the final half dozen Tiger 1s would leave the factory in August of 44, and that would be it. They would build just shy of 1,400 of these. Now, their kill-to-loss ratio was very good. It's hard to get completely accurate numbers. 10 to 1 is often said, but several factors come into it. But as you know, Germany was losing the war, and this was a mighty large and expensive tank. And with a skilled crew and gunner, it was very effective. This gun was very accurate if the gunner knew what they were doing. Unfortunately, by late 44, a lot of the skilled tankers were gone. So even though Tigers were at the Battle of the Bulge, they didn't do great, and the same goes for the Eastern Front with Russia. They were still being used and still knocking out Allied tanks into April of 45, of course. Still doing damage, but it is the true definition of a lost cause at this point. And it did cause the Allies to really rethink what they were doing too. And that may be the most interesting thing about the Tiger. By the way, there really was just one production model, the Ost-E. There was the Ost-D before it, but it's pre-production. Most of them were this one version with those minor changes. But this caused the Allies to reevaluate. In the USA, this is one of the key factors that meant that the M4 would be upgunned from 75mm to the 76mm high-velocity gun, although the Americans mostly just countered the Tiger with sure numbers. The British, because they faced it rather early on in North Africa, rushed the QF 17-pounder gun into service. It was a 76mm, but a high velocity. And at first it was a piece of towed artillery that did well against the Tiger, but then it was introduced to the Sherman Firefly, which would go up against the Tiger right after D-Day. And then, of course, that would ultimately lead in Britain to the Comet and the Centurion tank of Cold War fame. Kind of interesting, that. And as far as Russia, the Tiger caused the upgunning of the T-34 from the T-34-76 to the T-34-85. It also promoted more anti-tank guns, self-propelled guns, to be built. The Su-100 nominally, but really the big ones, the 122 and the 152 even. Russia made some really big anti-tank guns, and part of it was to take out the Tigers. Yeah, so it definitely pushed technology and guns forward, and also armor forward, because this gun was very accurate. It was said that these could penetrate a Sherman up to 2,000 meters. They could penetrate a Churchill at about 1,700 meters. And a T-34, thanks to mainly its sloped armor, at about 1,500 meters, and do so quite accurately. And while there were some advantages to the Panther's 7.5 centimeter gun, overall the 8.8 had a lot of devastation once it did penetrate, and of course more room for high explosive if you want to go that way too. So that's the Panzer 6, the Tiger 1. And next time we'll get to the King Tiger. But I think that's enough for today. So appreciate you hanging out with me and talking tanks. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon.